Without wanting to sound like a narcissist, I actually got the inspiration from myself. I'm one of these weird people that experiences hallucinations when I'm half asleep and half awake. So I see things, and rather more alarmingly, I hear things. So this story was a little bit of my own personal terror, I suppose.
So I've always been interested in dark stories ever since I was a child. I think the earliest memory I have is of my dad watching the 1989 Batman, and then ever since then it's sort of all these dark figures. But I think beyond the stylistic elements of horror stories or things like that, I feel like one of the things that you can do within that realm is explore the truths behind it. So for instance, when we did the Paradise Lost, when we turned Paradise Lost into a three-way dance, there's a lot of honesty and a lot of passion which is within those stories, it was really fun to explore and to tell that story.
So I don't have a background in theatre. I'm very much a writer, and that's kind of been my career since I started out. So when I started getting involved with more of the theatre stuff, I kind of wanted to have a go at everything really. But I think the one that I find most fun or most satisfying is probably costuming, because I feel like there's something really powerful about a costume in that it can change the way someone holds themselves, or the way someone talks, the way they walk, the way they feel about themselves. And I like how putting on that costume kind of is the gateway from person to character. When we did an adaptation of Angela Carter's In the Company of Wolves for Cheltenham Literature Festival in 2019, I found this most outrageous faux fur coat for Andrew to wear as the wolf. And it was just so funny that the way his demeanour changed from like putting that coat on and looking like a 1980s rock star. I really enjoy the costuming element. I find that really, really fun. Summoning Beetlejuice to rid my house of ghosts.
Mine was pumpkin carving, but that seems tame by comparison now.
Goth for life. Whispers in the dark.
Alice was sure she had closed the window before going to sleep. But the cold slipped under the blankets and tiptoed over her skin, chilling her awake. The curtain twirled like a dancer, wrapping and unwrapping itself around the post of her bed, and for a moment, the room was alive with movement. She took a minute to catch her breath, and the curtain's thrashing dance slowed to a subtle sway. Alice's eyes had not yet adjusted, her vision all but blotted out by the darkness, but she swore she caught a glimpse of something she couldn't place just behind the curtain. Her heart quickened. She reached out until she felt the warmth emanating from her husband's sleeping body and slid her hand over his ribs. She could feel his skin stretch with each languid breath, and she tried to settle her fitful breathing into his rhythm. Alice had been afraid of the dark for as long as she could remember. She felt as though there was a swirling vortex of demons living behind her eyelids, plaguing her sleep. Some nights she would wake screaming, her nightdress stuck to her skin, cold and clammy with sweat. But Gabriel would simply hold her in his firm embrace until her trembling stopped. It was impossible for her to sleep without him. The weight of his arms and the steady beat of his heart when her head was pressed against his chest were the only things which could stem her anxiety come nightfall. He was always there, steady, constant, unchanging. As Alice's thoughts calmed and refocused back into the room, her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and she could just make out the curves of Gabriel's face, his thick eyelashes twitching with a dream. The curtain billowed again, and the fabric whipped the bed frame with a crack. She dragged her eyes away from Gabriel, and the cold grip of terror clutched at her heart. A shadow was moving across the wall. She blinked hard, then opened her eyes as wide as she could, but even her sleep-dazed state and the darkness of the room couldn't convince her that this was just a trick of the light. While the curtain continued to flap and flutter, a dark shadow grew over the wall like a bruise. Alice watched it seep across the room, achingly slow, as though trying to move undetected. Her muscles twitched with adrenaline as she stared hard, and then realized that it had stopped. She stared at the still shadow on the wall for so long, she began to doubt whether she could see anything at all, and her terror subsided. It was just a shadow after all. Her skin became painfully aware of the cold night air swirling around it, and she slipped out of bed to go and close the wretched window. Alice turned to watch Gabriel as she pulled the flaking sash window down as gently as she could, hoping that the sharp scraping against its swollen wooden frame wouldn't wake him. She stared through the glass, out into the blackness of the night, but all that stared back at her was her own reflection, pale and wan in the moonlight. Until she saw the shadow move behind her. She dived back towards the bed and slid under the covers as quickly and quietly as she could, and squeezed her eyes closed so tightly she saw patterns dancing across her eyelids. The thundering of her own heartbeat flooded the room with noise, the thumping beats like footsteps pounding towards her. Eyes still squeezed shut, she shakily extended her hand, patting the mattress, searching for Gabriel. But he remained just out of reach, unaware of the unfolding terror around him. She forced in a deep breath and opened her eyes, fully expecting some intruder to be looming over her, wielding a hammer. But instead, the dark, disembodied presence was creeping up the wall and into a corner on the ceiling. Where at first it had mimicked a shadow, formless and indistinct, now dark tendrils stretched out from it, probing every surface it touched. Alice whimpered, and the tendrils merged and snaked towards her. She clasped her hands over her mouth and swallowed the cry that threatened to escape. The shadow hesitated. In the silence, the presence moved more tentatively, swaying back and forth. The motion reminded Alice of a pet rat she used to have. Alice remembered how he used to stand, swaying back and forth in what she thought was some kind of peculiar little ritual, until she found out that he was nearly blind, and the swaying was a way of helping him detect motion. So she lay there, as still and silent as a corpse, convinced that whatever the shadow was, it couldn't find her if she stayed completely still. She watched the mass creeping toward her and tried to keep breathing steady, though her lungs were burning from hyperventilation. The dark expanse groped across the ceiling, pulsating as it inched closer and closer to the bed. It lingered directly above Gabriel. As black tentacles began to drip down the wall towards her sleeping husband, Alice couldn't take it anymore. Her fear boiled over into anger, and she picked up one of the books piled beside her bed and flung it with all her strength at the shadow. The book exploded against the wall, and a flurry of pages rained down, waking Gabriel with such a shock that he sprang out of bed and snapped on the overhead light, bleaching everything out like an overexposed photograph for a few bewildering seconds. Alice shielded her eyes from the harshness of the light. Her body still pressed against the headboard, another book held tightly in her hands. When she uncovered her eyes, her gaze was still fixed on the ceiling directly above. Gabriel crawled over the bed, sat on his knees in front of her, took Alice's face gently in his hands, and turned her head down to face him. "What's wrong?" he asked, tilting his head to one side like a puppy. Glancing upwards at the ceiling to find nothing but the crack in the plaster that had been there since they moved in, he sighed sympathetically. "Look. See? There's nothing there." As Alice focused on her husband, her body stiffened. A nauseating fear bubbled in her stomach. She gasped, her breath stuttering as she did so. The face she was looking at was Gabriel's, without a doubt. But from it, staring back at her, were a set of dark eyes with smoky black tendrils wrapping around them.